For a century, foundational physics has been stalled by a mathematical contradiction. On one side, we have the smooth, continuous geometric manifolds of general relativity. On the other, the discrete, quantized combinatorics of quantum field theory. When these two models collide, the equations produce impossible infinite values. Rather than solving this incompatibility, modern physics relies on mathematical workarounds, like renormalization, to obscure these paradoxes. The theory of infinity recasts infinity as an absolute ontological primitive, the actual starting point of physical reality, rather than a computational failure. This framework uses a triadic architecture, where an infinite continuous substrate, the omega substrate, is channeled by symmetry operators. This process carves the substrate into stable, logically coherent domains, known as golden sets. Resolving the foundational crisis requires a geometric baseline, where finite physical structures are stabilized contexts drawn directly from an infinite plenum. This geometry operates on specific axiomatic rules. First, infinity is the universal set, the source of all physical structures. Second, symmetry acts as the universal operator, dictating that only invariant structures can survive to become observable reality. Third, not infinity and its golden set create topological anchors. As symmetry operations act on the continuous omega substrate, they carve out bounded, nested domains. Embedding every physical structure within this hierarchy of broader contexts resolves standard self-referential paradoxes. This creates a strict boundary for physical observation, known as the inner observation principle. Because observers are physically situated inside these localized golden sets, they do not possess unobstructed access to the full substrate. Since observers are context-bound, what classical physics considers independent properties, like momentum or energy, are actually localized, lower-dimensional projections of a unified topological chain. Under this framework, the physical vacuum is a structured modality-context chain, constructed from continuous phase-space potentials woven together by precise chiral twist vectors. Stable massive matter requires asymmetric chiral tension. This occurs when the acute overthreads and grave underthreads of the space do not match. Because geometry tension cannot resolve linearly, space itself bunches up. The continuous fabric binds into a rigid 3D volume, forming a topological knot. This geometry anchors the physical metric of spacetime with permanent rest mass. These knots constitute the Lepton sector, the longitudinal warp threads. Light operates under the condition of parity-even closure. For photons, acute and grave chiral twists are perfectly balanced. With a net zero twist charge, the fabric remains strictly flat, avoiding collapse into a mass-bearing state. The photon functions as a traveling, parity-balanced twist inversion. It shuttles across lepton knots, weaving physical context together. Matter and light are exact topological complements. A universe of only leptons is a pile of disconnected knots. A universe of only photons is a formless void. Both are required to weave a stable spacetime manifold. This topological accounting addresses the dye-energy dilemma, the apparent paradox where a photon's energy seems to be created or destroyed based solely on the observer's frame of reference during a Doppler shift. Standard rebuttals assume this energy is absorbed by the receding source. But if the source is astronomically distant or has collapsed into a singularity, this argument fails to maintain strict causal closure. The Conrad-Dye protocol resolves this through the law of conservation of modality. In the toroidal cosmological engine, a photon's energy is partitioned across manifest and latent components in a cyclical flow. During redshift, missing manifest energy becomes contextual tension, deposited into the negative space exhaust. Conversely, blue shift draws extra energy from this exact latent reservoir. To prevent this latent tension from accumulating to infinity, the system requires a mathematical closure condition. The toroidal engine is strictly capped by a volumetric limit derived from the inverse Laplacian, the Basel closure limit of pi squared over 6. Cosmological redshift is a lossless modality transition. Dark energy is a structural exhaust release triggered when the vacuum reaches this Basel capacity. For electromagnetism to function, The flat parity-even photon must be geometrically capable of interacting with the parity-broken lepton knots. Because the photon field only operates within the local 2D boundary of the inner observation principle, it cannot directly evaluate the 3D volume of the lepton knot. The holographic modality shear operator maps the 3D volume of the knot onto a 2D observable surface footprint. This shear brings the internal spatial curvature of the knot into alignment with the rigid boundary tension of the surrounding gauge manifold. To prevent the sheared knot from dissipating into a continuous ripple, the system requires the generation sieve as a structural anchor. This chart displays the logarithmic residual for the gauge C family. The residual drops to near zero at n equals 3, mathematically isolating 3 generations as the minimum required to absorb topological friction. At 4 generations, the residual spikes, tearing the fabric and destabilizing the localized particle. The Standard Model's limit of 3 fermion generations is an absolute geometric necessity for matter to remain stable within the spacetime fabric. Orchestrating these continuous symmetries and discrete boundaries is the Amanda engine, the discrete computational root of the framework. This engine utilizes internal audits and the Conrad backbone to force high-variance continuous chaos to collapse into stable linear invariance. This operational logic parallels Frent's higher dimensional domain. The Amanda engine maintains the integrity of this higher domain through algebraic seals, discrete boundaries that partition the continuous void into a computable state. One such seal is the 61' lock. Topological pressure forces a fracture in the 19-node lattice, stripping away scalar values to isolate the prime eigenvalue of 61. This lock secures the universal grid, slaving geometry to discrete integer boundaries. The result is a rigorously computable universe where the continuous void is deterministically anchored by discrete seals. The fabric ontology unifies the parity-broken 3D lepton knots and the parity-even 2D photon inversions into a single topological architecture. This geometry naturally resolves the mechanics of gauge interaction without resorting to the paradoxes of infinite renormalization. Physical observables like energy, momentum, and polarization are strictly localized, lower-dimensional projections filtered through a specific context boundary. Energy remains strictly conserved across manifest observation and latent toroidal tension, safely bounded by the pi²/6 limit. Holographic modality shear fundamentally requires exactly 3 generations of matter to absorb topological friction and maintain a stable manifold. The universe operates as a perfectly audited golden circuit, where fundamental constants, light, and cosmic expansion are strictly deterministic, interlocking mathematical gears.